All right. Well, good afternoon slash evening, everyone. Welcome back to week number 2 for PPA 500. I hope your second week in the program is going well for you and you're trying to stay cool out there because this is some ridiculous heat we're dealing with this week. Thank you for your introductory posts. I've gone through and read all of those. Again, those posts are ungraded, so you won't be getting a grade on those. But your first graded post is due on September 6th. That's Beach Board essay number 1. And so for Beach Board essay number 1, what you'll be doing is, again, you'll be reading Federalist Paper number 10 by James Madison. And then in your post, you will answer the question of, do you think that we are more factionalized as a society today than we were back in James Madison's times? And if so, why? If not, why not? And then what do you suggest we do about factions? And how do you suggest we better control the effects of factions in our society? So you'll be reading Federalist 10 and then doing that post, and then, of course, responding to at least 2 of your classmates' posts as well. So you have that as your first graded Beach Board essay, and that is due again by midnight on September 6th. I do recommend that if you can, get your initial post done earlier than that, because if we don't have any initial posts done, then no one has anything to respond to. So, try and get that initial post done earlier if possible, and then your 2 responses to classmates can then come in by midnight on September 6th. So you got that coming up for you on September 6th. And then also on September 6th, you also have your initial skill self-assessment that is due. I've received a few of those already and then returned those to you, or at least returned a grade to you. Again, it's an honest assessment. There are no right or wrong answers. If you answer 1 in section 2 for all those skills, that's absolutely fine. In number 1 for all the skills, that's absolutely fine. In section 2, if you say you don't have any experience across those core areas, that's absolutely fine as well. The feedback I'll give you is, thank you for the assessment, thank you for the clear, honest assessment, and you'll get the points for that assignment. Again, the real utility of this initial skills self-assessment is to then allow you, once you are leaving the program in 697, at the end of your time with us, you'll then be able to do your final skills self-assessment and do an assessment of your skills, looking back on when you entered the program compared to as you are departing the program. And hopefully you'll see some significant improvement in those responses on the final skills self-assessment. And then from an assessment perspective here as a faculty, what we do is we will take random samples every spring of those initial and final skills self-assessments from the portfolios. And we then calculate our mean scores on the initial, our mean scores on the final, and see how those scores have increased. And usually it's a very pronounced increase. Certainly all the increases across all the skills tend to be statistically significant every single spring when we do that. So initial skill self-assessment due by midnight on September 6th, and your first Beach Board essay and 2 responses to classmates also due by midnight on September 6th as well. Just to let you know, on September 14th, so not next week's class, but 2 weeks from tonight, our disciplinary librarian, Kelly Janicek, is going to be joining us, and she will be hosting the first 90 minutes of class on September 14th. And on that evening, what she will do is she will provide you an introduction and a primer on doing public administration and public policy related research using the databases provided by the library here at Cal State Long Beach. Now, some of you have gone undergrad to Long Beach, and so you've used the library frequently in your undergraduate careers. Some of you are brand new to Long Beach, and so even if you graduated from Long Beach and you've used the databases before, what Kelly will do is she will point out to you some of the databases that are especially useful for graduate level research in public administration and public policy. Now, you're not doing much research, obviously, here in this 500 class. It's kind of a get us going course in the program. But as you progress through the program and future courses, you will need to have those types of research skills. And so you'll get those in the first 90 minutes of our session on September 14th. Kelly does a great job with these presentations. I usually have her do it in all the 500 sections every semester. So she's been doing this for years, and she's truly an expert on these databases. It can really point you in the direction of which databases can be most useful for you in doing future research in public administration and public policy. So let's be mindful of that. That will be in the first half of our session on September 14th. I had her confirm that just a couple of days ago. So just to kind of foreshadow what we're going to do tonight. Tonight, we're going to get into our discussion of the foundations of American government. And we know that we have a unique system of public administration in this country. And the reason why we have a unique system of public administration is because it is housed within a unique system of governance. And our system of American government does have some idiosyncrasies and some nuances to it that you don't see in a lot of other governance structures around the world. So to better understand public administration here in the US, we obviously need to have a good, strong foundation in American government. And I know some folks in the program, you've come from a political science background, and so you've had political science in your undergraduate training. You're probably familiar with a lot of these concepts that we're going to discuss tonight. But I know we do have some people who come into the program from other majors as well. And as part of our reaccreditation, I did a student survey where I looked at where students got their undergraduate degrees from and what type of undergraduate degrees they had. And while it is true political science is the most common undergraduate degree, it's by far not a majority. It's a plurality. And so we have folks coming in the program from a variety of different backgrounds. And so that's why we want to spend some time here near the beginning of our time together in 500, covering the basics of American government so we can better understand the role of public administration and the role of bureaucracy as an institution in our system of American governance. But before we get to that point in time, last week I gave you an introduction to the program, and I know Dr. Matthews does an orientation, but I spoke with Dr. Matthews after class, and I realized that the link didn't get out, I guess, to everyone, and so everyone wasn't able to attend that orientation. So I don't know, for some folks, what we talked about last week may have been your first real orientation into the program. So I want to take a few minutes at the start of class tonight just to ask you, do you have any questions about the program, how you navigate your way through the program, any details or nuances from what we talked about last night that you have any questions at all about? So any programmatic questions?
Hi, Professor.
Hi.
I do have a question. I was one of these students that did not attend orientation prior to our first meeting. But you did mention last meeting that would count as orientation, correct?
Yes, last week's session will count as your orientation. So when you do the advancement to candidacy form, you can just put the date of our meeting last week as your orientation fulfillment.
Okay, perfect. So then I don't have to attend orientation with our graduate advisor again, or?
You're not required to. I would recommend if you're able to attend it, I would attend just because, Dr. Matthews is now our graduate advisor. And so if you do need to take some courses outside the department, or if you run into any administrative hurdles, Dr. Matthews will be the one to help you out with that during your time in the program. So if possible, I would attend.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Absolutely. Good questions. Happy to answer them. Any other questions about the program or anything at all in that regard?
Does the department?
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Sorry. Does the department offer a robust set of winter and summer courses to move, purposes to kind of just move along the program?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. In terms of summer, yes. So what the program normally offers, I can speak to the 10 years I was department chair. Dr. Butts is now the chair, and so he puts the summer schedule together. But I think he's kind of following the same pattern we've had over the past several years. So in summer, yes, we do have a robust selection of classes. We usually, and again, it's dependent upon enrollment. We have seen our summer enrollments go down, and as summer enrollments have gone down, that's kind of made us cancel some classes along the way. But traditionally, we offer all of the core courses in the summer, with the exception of this course, which won't matter because you're taking it now, and 697. So 697 is not offered in the summer. And the reason for that is because the way we do 697 is that we have assigned core content faculty grading each of the 5 case studies. And so your budgeting case study will be graded by Dr. Zhao. Your HR case study is graded by Dr. Martin. Your organization theory case study is typically graded by Dr. Baber, and when he's not able to grade it because of retirement, then I'll step in and grade the organization theory cases. Your policy analysis case is graded primarily by Dr. Matthews, and your research methods case is graded primarily by Dr. Butts, but I also step in and help him out with that workload since he's now newly taking on the responsibilities of department chair. So since we have all these individual faculty grading each individual case study, the only way that we would be able to offer 697 this summer is if we could offer a section taught by each one of those individual faculty members. The problem with that is that you're looking at a minimum of 5 sections of 697, and we don't have the enrollments to support 5 sections of 697, so it's kind of an all or nothing thing in the summer. So for the past couple of summers, we've been unable to offer 697 in the summer. Other than that, we have all the other core courses with the exception of 500, obviously. And we also then offer a limited number of electives. I offer a PPA 535 Intergovernmental Relations course. That counts as an elective in the program. I offer that every single summer. I know that Dr. Butts in the past has offered PPA 610, which is the seminar in urban affairs. I don't know if he'll be able to continue offering that as chair because he's kind of limited in his workload because here chairs have a 40% administrative assignment and 60% teaching assignment. And so it's really going to limit his ability to offer courses in the summer. But mostly it's going to be those core courses in the summer. Now, winter is much more limited. Winter term is a very brief term, and so we usually only offer Dr. Martin's course, which is usually Race and Inequality, which is a elective course in the program, and Dr. Baber's Organization Theory 660 course. And typically, those are the 2 courses that we usually offer in the winter. So not a whole lot in the winter, but a lot of core courses that you can take during the summer. Winter and summer here at Long Beach are run differently than fall and spring. Fall and spring are state-supported semesters. The summer and the winter are self-supported and run through the College for, they always change your name, the College of Professional Education, something like that. College of Professional and Continuing Education. There it is. The College of Professional and Continuing Education, otherwise known as CPACE. They are basically in charge of the summer and the winter courses. And so they have a different fee structure in the summer and the winter. So unfortunately, summer and winter courses are a little bit more expensive because CPACE is in charge of those fees than what you would pay in the normal fall and the spring semesters. The nice thing about summer courses, though, is that they are 6 weeks in duration. So the way summer works is we offer courses in the first summer session, which usually begins right at the end of spring semester and runs through about July 4th, the very beginning of July. And then also in the third summer session, which then begins the second week of July and then runs through up to just the beginning of fall semester. So those are 6-week courses, so it allows you to get the courses done even quicker than you would with a hybrid course like this one. And I think students do like that a lot. But again, it's going to depend upon paying the slightly higher fee to take those courses and whether or not we have the enrollment to offer all those class sections. Again, since it's a self-support program in the summer, we as a department now need to balance our own summer budget. In the past, the college subsidized everything, so we could offer courses with 5 or 6 people in them. and any deficit would then be picked up by the college. The college doesn't do that anymore because the college ended up, as a result of that, having about a $1.5 million deficit. So they no longer do that. Now balancing the budget is the responsibility of the department. So typically we're usually not able to make a class run unless we have at least 10 or so students in the class, depending upon who's teaching it, in order to make it run. So if we have a class with 3 or 4 students registered, those courses unfortunately end up being eliminated from the schedule in that summer. Now it's a long-winded answer, but I think it's important to kind of explain how summer works because this is a different type of arrangement than fall and spring. Any other questions about the program or anything at all like that? This is not your only time to ask questions, obviously. Every week we get together. If a question emerges or occurs to you between now and next week, you can always ask it in class next week, because if you have the question, chances are other people in the class also have the same question. So it's good that we can do it, kind of answer the questions as a class. So
I have a couple questions on the responses to on the beach board assignments. How long are the responses supposed to be?
Yeah, I know in the syllabus we say 3 to 4 paragraphs. In class last week, I said usually 2 to 3 will suffice. So 2 to 3 paragraphs for your response to that initial prompt that I have placed in there. And then for your responses to classmates, I think 1 paragraph per response is certainly sufficient.
Okay, sorry, you said 2 to 3 paragraphs for the initial response and then a paragraph for the response?
Yeah, then a paragraph for each response to a classmate, because you're going to be doing a total of 3 posts. Your first post will be that 2 to 3 paragraph response to the prompt I've placed in there. And then your other 2 posts will be responding to classmates' posts. And those only have to be about a paragraph each.
Okay, gotcha. And just on the question itself, I was just wondering if factionalism is the same thing as polarization.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you. Could you repeat that one more time?
Just on the question itself, I was wondering if factionalism was the same thing as polarization.
Good question. It can be. Factionalism, we're talking about, groups that have different goals and objectives that come into conflict with each other. And so what factions do is they will use the political process in order to achieve their goals and achieve their policy aims and their program aims. When you have a lot of polarization, like we see currently in this country, it kind of hardens those factions. And so you might have liberal factions and conservative leading factions. And so I think polarization really kind of hardens those factions, and sometimes it makes it more difficult for those factions to find common ground. So I think they are certainly 2 very closely related terms.
Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, that's an excellent question. Okay, well, again, if any other questions emerge, programmatic questions or otherwise, feel free to ask them at the next class session, or feel free to send me an email. And I'm happy to answer any questions you have via email as well. So what I thought we would do tonight is we'll kind of think of tonight's session in 2 parts. The first part of tonight's session will be a discussion of American government, the institutions of American government, the basics of American government, where American democracy / republic came from. We'll talk about power tonight. We'll talk about the 3 different types of power and how power manifests itself in American government. We'll talk about how we got to the point in time where we have the Constitution that we currently have today, and what forces kind of led to that Constitution. Then we'll take a break about halfway through. And then the second half of class, we'll turn our attention to the Constitution. And we'll go through the Constitution, not every single word of the Constitution, but we'll go through the Constitution, we'll highlight the major elements of the Constitution, and then talk a bit about what the framers had to say about the Constitution, especially what they had to say in the Federalist Papers, like Federalist Paper 51 and Federalist Paper 39. We won't talk a lot about Federalist Paper number 10 because I want you to read that as the basis for your discussion board posts for September 6th. But next week, once I've read your discussion board posts, then next week If there's anything missing from that discussion and discussion board on Federalist number 10, we can circle back and bring that into the class next week. So in the first half of class, let's talk a bit about American government. And again, I'm sure you're familiar with all of these concepts, and you've probably heard them ad nauseum before, especially if you've taken political science classes. But as you know, our Constitution and our system of government is very much predicated on this idea of separating power, that power should not be coalesced in the hands of one individual. When you think about the framers and the experience that they were coming out of, they were coming out of the experience in England, where it was a monarchy and power was concentrated in the hands of the monarch, of the king. Obviously, that's something that they wanted to avoid with the construction of their new system of government. So they were very, very interested in separating powers. The way in which, as you know, we separate powers in our Constitution, in our form of government, is we separate power both horizontally as well as vertically. We separate powers horizontally through separation of powers having three different distinct branches of government: a legislature, an executive, and a judicial branch. That's something that was talked about a lot by Madison in Federalist Paper number 51, and how important it is to balance these branches against each other. We also see in the Federalist Papers the phrase used, balancing ambition against ambition. So we can balance the ambitions of the legislature against the ambitions of the executive, against the ambitions of the judiciary. But in the discussions among the delegates leading up to the adoption of the Constitution, there was a very robust discussion about what the nature of the executive should be and what the nature of the presidency should be. For some of the framers, they wanted the president to come out of Congress. They want the president to be a member of Congress. Obviously, that would be problematic because that would concentrate the vast majority of power in the legislative branch. Some of the framers, Alexander Hamilton and others, talked about having a plural presidency, a plural executive, where you would have more than one person serving as president. The issue that the framers had to contend with is they wanted to create an executive that could balance its power with the legislature, but also could be able to act decisively enough. I think what they did realize is when you have a legislature, like if you have a parliament, that in that legislature or that parliament, you have many different people with many different opinions and many different wants, needs, and desires. So acting quickly can be very difficult in a legislative body. And we see that every day in Congress. And we always lament the gridlock in Congress. And well, why can't Congress get anything done? Why can't Congress act? Well, there are a lot of reasons for it that we'll talk about in this class. But one of the reasons is you have 435 members of the House and 100 members of the Senate. And it's very difficult. It's like herding cats, as we say, in order to get people onto the same page. When you have a singular president, a singular executive, that person obviously can react much quicker in the case of a disaster or the case of some type of an emergency. When you think about the response to the COVID-19 pandemic, one thing that political scientists have realized is that the power of governors greatly increased as a result of that COVID-19 pandemic because it was the singular governors who were able to react much quicker to an emergency than the state legislatures. And I think that's just the nature of having a singular executive. Several of the framers, including Alexander Hamilton, referred to the judiciary, the third branch of government, as being the least dangerous branch of government. And I think one of the reasons for that is because members of the federal judiciary of the Supreme Court, as it talked about in Article 3, are appointed by the president. And they're basically not there to get reelected. They're there for life or good behavior. And so they really viewed that judiciary as kind of being that least dangerous of the three different branches of government. But this horizontal separation of powers is something obviously we still have today, but it's a dynamic relationship in that at times we have seen presidents dominate Congress. At other times we have seen Congress dominate presidents. To give you an example, we've had some leaders in Congress, and one example is former Speaker of the House many, many years ago, Thomas Brackett Reed. And Thomas Brackett Reed was a very powerful Speaker of the House, and he was able to wield his power in a way to dominate much weaker presidents who served during Thomas Brackett Reed's time as Speaker. Joseph Cannon is another example of a very strong Speaker of the House. Newt Gingrich, more recently, exerted a lot of his authority as Speaker of the House. Jim Wright, on the Democratic side, exerted a lot of power as Speaker of the House. I think you can make the argument that Nancy Pelosi, currently as Speaker of the House, is kind of in that same, cut from that same cloth in terms of exerting power of Congress. At other times, we've had very powerful presidents that have dominated both Congress and the Supreme Court. Example of that would be someone like FDR. FDR, with his New Deal programs after the Great Depression, dominated Congress and was able to get his programs through Congress and also dominate the Supreme Court. In that some of those programs that were initially created by FDR as part of the New Deal were found to be unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. FDR's response to that was to threaten court packing. And he threatened the Supreme Court with, well, if you're not going to approve these things, what I will do is I will increase the size of the Supreme Court, thus diluting your authority and power as a sitting justice. Now, we can't really draw a causal effect there because there really wasn't a whole lot of social science going on at that time. But I think any reasonable person could look at it and say, well, that probably did have an impact, because not long after his court packing threat, FDR then saw a lot of these programs that were originally declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court started finding them constitutional and allowing them to go forward. So that's an example of a very strong president exerting power over another branch of government. We got that horizontal separation of powers. Then we also have the vertical separation of powers in our form of federalism. In federalism, we divide up power between the national government and state governments. Now, under constitutional federalism, we only talk about national and state governments. We don't talk about local governments because local governments have no standing in the national constitution. The only protections that local governments have will come to them via state constitutions. So if a state wants to give power to a local government, it will do so in its state constitution. So no mention of local governments in the national constitution, only two levels of government, national versus state. Well, and we'll see this a little bit later on as we talk about some of the dynamics that led to the creation of the Constitution. But we essentially had two different factions. We had the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. Federalists believed that we should have a stronger national government for national defense and for helping repay the debts incurred by the Revolutionary War. Anti-Federalists believed that states should be the repositories of power, that states were sovereign, they should retain power, and the only power that they give up to the national government is for the purpose of defense from either foreign invasion or defense against domestic insurrection. So those two factions battled it out very forcefully in the Constitutional Convention to try and get their interests represented in this system of federalism, the relationship between national and state governments. So we separate power both horizontally as well as vertically. And if you're wondering, that president there on the screen is James Polk, is actually the president on the screen. Our system of government not only separates power horizontally and vertically, but our system of government is also a democratic republic. You hear it all the time, the famous quote from Benjamin Franklin when he was asked if the government would survive, what type of government we have, and he responded, it's a republic if we can keep it. We are both a democracy as well as a republican form of government. So when we say the word democracy, because there are a lot of countries around the world that call themselves democracies. In fact, there are a lot of countries around the world that use the term democratic in the actual title of the country and put democratic on their flags. But countries that call themselves democratic are not always democratic forms of government. So what makes a government a democracy? That's my question to you. What makes a government a democracy? And again, you can use your microphone, or you can use text chat, whatever you are most comfortable with. So what makes something a democracy? Anybody? What makes something a democracy? Voting. Yeah, Rebecca says in text chat, voting. Absolutely, that participation. Yeah. Let's see, where else we go? Nia says, to the people, for the people, by the people. Absolutely. Roxanne says, the people. Yeah. The people participate in their own governance. There you go. What Ryan is saying, people are able to participate in government without feeling coerced to choose a side due to fear, retaliation, etc. Yes, we are able to openly participate in our own governance. And we oftentimes do that through the vehicle of voting. So in a democracy, at least in theory, power comes from the people. People participate in their own self-governance. They participate in their own governing themselves, their own self-determination directly. And so we have some vestiges of a democracy here in this country. We all live here in the state of California, and California has a lot of different voting devices that are very democratic in nature. And again, we're saying democratic, not the political party. We're talking democratic in terms of people participate in their own decision making, people participate in their own self-governance. So one example of that is, what we call an initiative process. Here in the state of California, if citizens feel passionately enough about an issue, they can start a petition and start an initiative petition. If they get enough signatures on that petition that are then verifiable signatures, they can force an issue onto the ballot, and then Californians can then vote on that issue. And we see a lot of propositions that we vote on, especially in elections like what are coming up in November. Even year elections, midterm or presidential elections, we tend to see a whole lot of those types of propositions. Propositions can come from the initiative process, where people put that issue on the ballot, and then people vote on that issue rather than leaving the voting to their representatives in Sacramento. We also have what's called a referendum process. And the difference between an initiative and a referendum is that with an initiative, people gather signatures, and it's the public that force an issue onto the ballot. In a referendum, it's the state legislature that decides, we don't want to vote directly on this as a state legislature, so we're going to vote to put it on the ballot and allow the people to vote on it directly. So constitutional amendments oftentimes are done through that type of a referendum type of process. With initiatives and referenda, you've got very much a democratic type of an approach, where people are directly making decisions themselves and participating directly in their own self-governance. We have come to accept that here in California as kind of the norm. But believe me, when people come to California and they look at the ballots that we have when we vote, they're absolutely shocked at the number of propositions that we have on our ballots, because other states oftentimes don't have the initiative or the referendum process in their respective states. So here in California, we are very much oriented around a democratic approach to self-governance. So we are a democracy, but we are also a Republican form of government. Again, a small r Republican form of government. In a Republican form of government, we elect people to make decisions for us. So we elect people to go to Washington, D.C. and represent us in the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate. We elect people to go to the state house and to the state senate to represent us in Sacramento. So we elect 80 people to go and serve in our state house and 40 people to go and serve in our state senate. We elect people to go and serve on our city council. Typically 5 people serve on a city council. We elect people to serve on our school boards. We elect people to serve as county supervisors. We elect people to serve on, regional water districts, and so on and so on. So whenever we elect somebody to go and make decisions for us, that's a Republican form of government. So we are both a democracy as well as a Republican form of government. We are a democratic republic. And that's the basic structure we have in our system of government. As a democratic republic, and as a democratic republic that tries to limit the power of government, we limit the power of government because our system is predicated on this theory known as social contract theory. And if you were a political science major, I'm sure you've read Thomas Hobbes and his Leviathan. I'm sure you've read John Locke and his treatise on government, especially his second treatise on government. The idea of social contract theory comes from John Locke's second treatise on government. Writing before John Locke was Thomas Hobbes, and Thomas Hobbes in his famous work Leviathan basically argued that in order for people to be safe and for people to be protected and for their possessions to be protected, we needed to give up power to this Leviathan, this powerful government that would then look out for our interests and would protect us from each other. That in our natural state, the natural state of personkind is a natural state of violence and conflict. And so we need a powerful Leviathan government to protect us. John Locke, in his second treatise on government, took a kinder and gentler approach, if you will, to the state of nature of man. And John Locke argued that under social contract theory, power and rights are retained by the people. So power and rights come from citizens. Citizens then enter into a contract with their government. In that contract, citizens then decide what powers and what rights to give up to government that government will then use in a judicious manner to then provide for the welfare of society. But the power doesn't reside with government. The power initially resides with people, and then people enter into a contract with their government. People give up rights and power, and then government agrees and promises to use that judiciously in order to provide for what society needs. That social contract obviously comes in the form of a constitution. So the Constitution we're going to spend time talking about in the second half of class tonight, that is our social contract between the people and their government. Now, the upshot of all that is when you have this contract between people and the government, the question then becomes, well, what happens when one party violates that contract? Well, if the one party is a member of the public that violates the contract, we have a legal system that deals with those types of violations. If, however, it's the government and government officials that violate the contract and are no longer using these rights and powers given to them by the people to provide for the welfare of society, then we have a very big issue. And according to Rousseau and Thomas Jefferson and some other political philosophers of the time, not only do people have a right to overthrow their government if that government is violating the Constitution, the social contract, but they actually have an obligation to do so. I know that sounds, no pun intended, very revolutionary, but that was the position of Rousseau. That was also the position of Thomas Jefferson himself. So this is a sacred contract that we have between people and their government, and both parties need to abide by that sacred contract. So the founders knew that they believed in social contract theory. They really believed very much in John Locke and his writings, so much so that Thomas Jefferson literally lifted passages from John Locke's second treatise on government and used them for his own writings. So things such as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness that Thomas Jefferson wrote, that was lifted directly from John Locke, who wrote about life, liberty, and property. So John Locke, for instance, would say that you cannot deprive someone of life, liberty, or their property without due process of law. And here we have Thomas Jefferson saying you can't deprive someone of life, liberty, or the pursuit of happiness, again, without due process of law. So there's a lot of overlap between Jefferson's writings and Locke's writings. I guess probably if you would put some of Jefferson's writings through Turnitin, probably would get a pretty high similarity score with John Locke and some of the work that he did previously. But the framers really believed in social contract theory. And so they needed to come up with a contract between people and their government. So the contract they came up with was referred to as the Articles of Confederation. And I provided a link for you to read the Articles of Confederation. I hope you had a chance to at least just take a cursory glance at it. We're not going to go through it here tonight, but I do want to highlight some of the perceived flaws with the Articles of Confederation, because obviously we no longer live under the Articles of Confederation. The framers at the Constitutional Convention got rid of the Articles and replaced them with the Constitution that we all know and love today. But the Articles of Confederation, it was designed to be what we call a firm league of friendship. And those are the terms that are actually used in the Articles. That creates a firm league of friendship between the states. Well, a firm league of friendship is good. It means that we're there to support each other as states, but it's not as ironclad as what you get with the United States of America created under the Constitution. A couple more examples. In the Articles of Confederation, the term United States of America as a proper noun is used only one time in the Articles of Confederation, where the Articles say the style of this confederacy shall be the United States of America in capital. So when they capitalize United States of America as a proper noun, they only do it then when they're giving a title to what the country will be called. Throughout the remainder of the Articles of Confederation, whenever we refer to the United States, we typically do it, or they typically did it in lowercase United States, and they refer to it as the United States in Congress assembled. That's a really important passage, because what that means to us in the Articles is that we were the United States. We were this national entity, but only when the states got together in this Congress. Today, when we think about the word Congress, we picture, what we had on our first slide there. We picture Capitol Hill and all the institutions of Congress, the Russell Building and all those types of things. However, for the framers, they didn't necessarily use Congress as the proper noun. They use it in the term of being a meeting. So a Congress is a meeting. So you could argue that tonight we are having a Congress of PPA 500. We're having a meeting of PPA 500. So think about the importance of that. When you're saying the United States in Congress assembled, you're saying that we are the United States when all the states get together and make decisions. But the decision makers are not the United States government. The decision makers are the individual state governments coming together in this Congress or in this meeting. So as such, you have very much of a confederation, a confederacy that was created. And the important aspect of a confederacy is that in a confederacy, each individual member, each state retains its own sovereignty. And so when you're looking at where the power lies with those individual sovereign states. So as such, in the Articles of Confederation, we didn't have any type of a standing army at the national level. Our protection was being provided by individual state militias. We had very little ability to regulate commerce between the different states. We had very little of ability to impose one uniform currency. And we had situations where one state was using one form of currency, another state was using another form of currency. We didn't really have any mechanism for quelling disagreements between states. And so if you had two states that were both claiming the same territory, like Pennsylvania and Virginia did, you had skirmishes between those two states as they battled with each other over what their boundaries should look like and what their jurisdiction should be. And in the Articles, you had very little ability to try and control those types of disagreements. And there's a whole laundry list of some of the problems with the Articles. All really boils down to the fact that the Articles did not create much of a national government at all. It created a Congress, a meeting of the states, which was infrequent at best. We didn't have an independent executive. Our first presidents came out of Congress, and they were members of Congress who were selected to be president. Samuel Huntington is an example of one of our first presidents. Had very little to no power. We really didn't have much of a mechanism for resolving disputes in terms of an independent judiciary. So there are a lot of problems that people start to realize very quickly with the Articles of Confederation. But as oftentimes happens, and you'll see this as you go through the program, and especially when you get to 670 policy analysis, major changes to policy in this country usually happen as the result of some type of a triggering event. So some type of triggering event occurs that galvanizes public opinion around the idea that we need to make a change to the way in which we are doing things. You probably learned in your history classes about this thing called Shays' Rebellion. Shays' Rebellion was a rebellion led by a retired Army captain by the name of Daniel Shays, and he led a rebellion of farmers against the state capital. Shay was leading these farmers because they were very upset about losing their farms. They didn't have money to maintain their farms. They were, paying these taxes that were making it difficult for them to essentially stay in business. They rebelled. Shay led this rebellion. Eventually, the rebellion was put down by the state militia, but it took quite a bit of time for the state militia to put down this rebellion led by a retired Army captain and comprised of everyday, ordinary farmers. That was a real triggering event, because what that led a lot of people to question is, if our state militia is having so much trouble putting down a rebellion of farmers, what are we going to do if we have a larger insurrection? Or what are we going to do if we are invaded by France or some other established foreign nation? So those concerns about protection and those concerns for having the national government have a mechanism to better protect us was one of the contributing factors to then lead to the Constitutional Convention. The purpose of the Constitutional Convention was not to replace the Articles of Confederation. The initial purpose of the convention was merely to review and amend those articles. Another major problem with the articles is, in order to amend the articles, you had to have unanimous support from all of the states. So all states had to agree in order to amend deficiencies with the Articles of Confederation. Well, the problem with that is, good luck getting all your states to agree to anything. And so in order to amend it, we then had to have this Constitutional Convention. So at the Constitutional Convention, the initial goal was just to amend, to make changes to strengthen the Articles of Confederation. What initially happened is that you had some delegates who arrived to the Constitutional Convention before others. When you think about the state of the roads back then and your ability to travel was very difficult. You were traveling across dirt roads that would then become muddy roads whenever it would rain, and it was difficult for some delegates to get there. The delegates who arrived first at the Constitutional Convention were people like James Madison and those who were in the Federalist camp, those who believed that we needed a stronger national government. And those were the delegates who got there first. By the time the anti-Federalists got there, people like Sherman and others, by the time they rolled into town, the Federalists had already gotten the ball rolling toward not amending the Articles, but actually getting rid of the Articles and replacing them with a brand new Constitution. And James Madison was the person who was probably most instrumental in getting the Articles done away with and replaced with this new Constitution. So the Constitutional Convention, you had delegates there who all fit kind of the same profile. If you were going to be a delegate, you would have to be white, you would have to be male, you would have to be a property owner, and chances are you would have to come from the upper socioeconomic strata. You would have to come from the upper echelons, if you will, of society. So they all kind of fit that same profile. They were the creditors. For the most part, the delegates at the Constitutional Convention were the ones who had loaned their money to make the Revolutionary War possible. They were the ones who paid the money to muster the troops and paid the money to purchase the armaments and all those types of things. So when you get to the Constitutional Convention, you have these delegates who were basically bickering over three main areas. There were three main conflicts at the Constitutional Convention. And these are important because how these conflicts were resolved really created the substance and the nature of the Constitution that emerged from that Constitutional Convention. So as you probably know from your undergraduate political science courses, one of the major conflicts was the conflict between large and small states. We had some states with relatively large populations, such as New York and Pennsylvania, Virginia. We had some other states that had smaller populations, like Rhode Island, Delaware, New Jersey. And the large and small states had a disagreement about representation in Congress. Large states obviously wanted proportional representation, because if you base representation on population, they'll have more representatives and they will do better in Congress. Small states were obviously concerned about that, so they wanted equal representation. We had the Virginia plan, which was for proportional representation, offered up obviously by Virginia. We had the New Jersey plan that called for equal representation, offered up obviously by New Jersey. The way in which we came to a compromise was what was called the Connecticut Compromise. And in the Connecticut Compromise, or the Great Compromise, we decided to create a bicameral legislature. So create a two-house Congress, a House of Representatives with proportional representation, and a U.S. Senate with equal representation. Members of the House of Representatives would then be elected directly by the people. Members of the U.S. Senate would be selected by state legislatures. That's what gave us our bicameral two-house Congress. And that was the compromise that resolved this conflict between large and small states. Then the second conflict was the conflict between slave and non-slave states. And admittedly, this is where the framers really dropped the ball. This is where the framers did not resolve this in any type of an adequate manner. The compromises they came to in order to try and resolve this, the 3/5 compromise and the prohibition against banning the slave trade until at least 1808. Again, two compromises that certainly did not serve us well, and two compromises that really laid the framework and the groundwork for the Civil War that would occur less than 100 years later. In this whole debate at the Constitutional Convention, another issue that came up was, again, this Federalist versus anti-Federalist conflict. So we had one faction made up of Federalists, led by people like Hamilton and James Madison, who believed we needed to get rid of the Articles and create a much stronger national government. Then you have the anti-Federalists, people like Sherman, who wanted to maintain the Articles and only strengthen them enough to allow the national government to have the ability to provide protection to the states in the event of an insurrection or a foreign invasion. So this conflict between Federalists and anti-Federalists really set up our system of federalism. And as I mentioned before, the Federalists, people like Madison, had gotten there first. And so they had gotten the ball rolling toward a much stronger national government than we ever saw under the Articles of Confederation. So in this debate between the Federalists and the anti-Federalists, what Madison had to do is he had to convince the anti-Federalists that they actually wanted more out of this national government than just protection from foreign invasion. And so the way that Madison was able to do that is he was able to touch a nerve with these anti-Federalists. Again, remember, the delegates who were there were white, they were male, they were property owners, they were the ones who were the creditors. So what Madison was able to do with the anti-Federalists is to appeal to them on an economic basis. He said, you are the creditors. You are not getting your debts repaid that you put out for the Revolutionary War. If we create a stronger national government, you will be able to get your debts repaid. And then we all know what Alexander Hamilton eventually did with the creation of the Department of Treasury and the ability of the national government to have a lot more fiscal and monetary influence than anything we ever could have thought up under the Articles of Confederation. But once Madison was able to convince the Anti-Federalists that you want more out of this government than just protection, you want the national government to help you get your debts repaid, it was essentially game over for the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists won the day, and that's how we ended up getting a much stronger national government in the new Constitution and the system of federalism that was incorporated within that new Constitution. So the Constitution is really a series of compromises. Compromises between large and small states, horrible compromises between slave and non-slave states, a series of compromises in terms of the strength of the national versus state governments to appease both Federalists as well as Anti-Federalists. It really is a collection of compromises. As a collection of compromises, you know what happens when people compromise. I give up something, you give up something. Neither of us are totally happy with the final result, but we can live with that final result. And so over time, over the next 200 years, there's really been an ebb and flow in terms of things such as the balance of power across the different branches of government, the balance of power between national and state governments, the balance of power up until the Civil War between slave and non-slave states. It's really been open to a lot of dynamic interpretation because the Constitution really is just a set of compromises to try and deal with these types of issues. Now, we're going to look at the Constitution in depth in the second half of class 9. So instead of talking about the Constitution now, let's hold off on that. We'll get to that in the second half of class, and we'll go through the 7 articles and the 27 amendments and really see what the framers actually put into that Constitution. But before we get there, we've been talking a lot tonight about the term power. We're talking about separation of power horizontally. We've talked about separation of power vertically between federal and state governments. There's been a lot of discussion of this term power. Power is a term that is kind of intuitive to us, but I always say if you get 10 political scientists in a room and you ask them to define power, you'll probably come out with 10 different definitions. So my question to you is, define power. What does the word power mean to you? And there are no right or wrong answers here. We're just kind of getting started with this. So define power for me. What does it mean to have power over someone else? How do we exercise this term power? Because power is a term we use all the time. And sometimes we do ourselves a disservice by using it too much. There you go. I like that. Rebecca. It's the ability to bring about change or influence. Absolutely. Roxanne, it's the ability to control. Fernando, the ability to influence. Very broadly, Ryan says very broadly, the ability to require or force someone to do something. I agree with all those. Essentially with power, when we normally think about power, we're thinking about the ability to influence someone or something. So if we're able to influence someone to do something or act in a certain type of way, the way in which we want them to, we're exerting power over them. And oftentimes we influence others to do something we want them to do through the allocation and the use of resources. And so resources are oftentimes very much connected to this idea of power. So I think it's a pretty good definition. The power is the ability to influence or coerce someone to do something that they otherwise may not do. And if you're able to influence, you're using your resources in order to exert power over those individuals. What I would like for us to do in this class is to take a little bit more nuanced approach to power. And one of my favorite authors is an author by the name of John Gaventa. And I'll put his name in text chat. And I'll talk and type at the same time and see if I can multitask. John Gaventa. And John Gaventa did a very famous study where he wanted to really drill down into what power is and how is power being exercised. So he thought one way to do it is to go to an area of the country where there are great disparities in power. So he decided to go to rural Appalachia. So he went into rural Appalachia and he went into a coal mine town. And when I was in graduate school, the school I went to was in Ohio, and it was very kind of right there on the border of rural Appalachia. And in Appalachia, you do have these disparities in power between individuals. And you see that most notably again in a coal mine type of operation. So he went to a coal mine town and he wanted to ask the question, how do these coal mine owners, these coal mine companies, how do they exert so much influence over the coal mine workers? How are they getting these coal miners to do things that are clearly counter to their own self-interests? So in this coal mine town, pretty much the only employer in town was the coal mine. You know, they employed pretty much everyone in town. The coal mine workers were being required to work in dangerous mine conditions and to sometimes work 70 and 80-hour weeks. If you know anything about coal mining is a very dangerous type of occupation. There's a very famous case in public administration that happened in the state of Illinois called the Blast in Centralia. And the Blast of Centralia talks about an explosion in a mine under the ground that is still burning today. Decades later, that fire is still burning under the ground. Many people lost their lives. It's a very dangerous type of occupation. Mines have this nasty tendency to explode because you have gases in the mines. Whenever you are mining, you're releasing those gases. When you release those gases, if you have any type of open flame, or if when your pickaxe hits the rock, if it causes a spark, it ignites the gas, the mine explodes, and many people die. Coal mines also have a tendency to collapse, that their initial structure that are created are not sufficient over time to hold that mine up. And so many coal miners have died in coal mine collapses. There is a process that coal mine owners can use to make mines safer. And in coal mining, it's a process called dusting. If you dust the mine, you kind of tamp down all those gases so that if there is an open flame, the gases are all tamped down underneath the dusting. And so therefore there's less of a risk for explosion. But dusting takes time. It also costs money. It requires labor. And a lot of coal mine owners didn't want to put that resource into actually dusting the mine. So they allowed the gas to build up in the mine, and inevitably there would be a disaster that would cost human lives. So it's a very dangerous condition. They're working many, many hours in the mines every week. When they got paid, in some of these coal mine towns, you got paid not with money, but you got paid with tokens. So the coal mine owners would pay you with tokens. The only place those tokens could be redeemed would be in the company store. You hear all those old songs about I sold my soul to the company store. That's what they're talking about. So everything you buy, you bought from the company store using tokens given to you by the coal mine owners. So you can see the kind of vicious cycle that coal miners found themselves in. So what the coal mine owners are able to do is they're able to get these miners to work in dangerous conditions, which was counter to their self-interest, to work very, very long hours, counter to their self-interest, to get paid in tokens rather than money, counter to their self-interest, and so on and so on. So Gaventa wants to know why coal mine owners were able to exert that much influence and that much power over these coal miners. What he found is that the power they were exerting really can be broken up into three different types, or what he called three different faces of power. The first type, or the first face of power, and this is my term, not his, is kind of an overt power. In overt power, it's something that both parties are aware of. So when I was teaching on campus, the example I would always use is you get your exam back, you don't like the score you got on your exam, so you come up behind me and you push me out the window of the SSPA building. That's overt power. If I see you coming, I know you're pushing me out the window. You know you're pushing me out the window. We both know that you are exerting power over me to influence me to do something I otherwise would not do, fall out the window to my death or my maiming. That's overt power. Believe it or not, Gaventa argues overt power, this first phase of power, is actually the least dangerous. unless you're the person falling out the window, it's the least dangerous space of power because both parties know what's going on. The party being influenced knows the power is being exerted over them. The party that's exerting the power knows exactly what they were doing. So it makes it least dangerous because everybody knows what's going on. The second phase of power he refers to as mobilization of bias. Mobilization of bias, according to Gaventa, is a more dangerous type of power because the individual who's having power exerted over them may not even know what is going on. So the coal mine workers knew that they were working long hours, that they were dangerous conditions, but they weren't able to do anything about it. They didn't understand why nothing was being done to make the mine safer. Nothing was being done because the state legislature would not consider any bills about mine safety. So any bills, any issues of mine safety never made their way through the state legislature. Why? Because the coal mine owners obviously were able to lobby the state legislature, were able to, through donations to elected officials, keep those types of safety issues off of the agenda. And that's what mobilization of bias is. It's the ability to keep an issue off of a decision-making agenda. If coal mine safety never gets on the agenda of the state legislature will never talk about it. The state legislature will never pass a bill governing mine safety. So the ability to agenda set and to control the agenda is mobilization of bias. And that's what was going on in this coal mine town. The miners knew the dangerous conditions. They knew all these bad things. They didn't understand what was going on, that the state legislature wasn't coming in and helping to keep them safe. So that's mobilization of bias. That was absolutely going on in this case study. But the third and most dangerous phase or type of power he referred to as co-optation. In co-optation, one person, one individual, or one party will co-opt the opinions of the other party and will get the other party to believe that what's going on is actually in their best interest. And Gaventa argues there's a lot of co-optation going on, where the coal mine owners were able to co-opt the opinions of the workers. They were able to convince the miners that, yes, working these extra hours in the mine were good for you because they're good for the company. Yes, it's good for you to buy everything in the company store because you're keeping it local and you're keeping it here in the community. So yes, it actually is good for you to get paid in tokens. Yes, it's good for you to work in dangerous mine conditions because it costs so much to dust the mines, we're going to have to pay you less in tokens and you won't have as good of a quality of life for your family. So they were able to get coal mine workers to do things that were obviously counter to their self-interest by co-opting their opinions. That is the most dangerous phase of power, according to Gaventa, because with co-optation, the party that is having the power exerted over them oftentimes has no idea. They don't know what's going on. They just believe this is really in my best interest, when it could be 180-degree opposite of what their true best interest really is. So what Gaventa saw is a lot of mobilization of bias, agenda setting, and a lot of co-optation. And those are the more dangerous phases of power. Yeah, I can dig up Gaventa. It's actually Gaventa. It's a book. It's called Power and Powerlessness in Rural Appalachia. So I'm not sure if I can, get the book in its totality on our website. I'll check on copyright laws, and if I can, I'll put it up there. But it's called Power and Powerlessness in Rural Appalachia. It's by John Gaventa. So I think it's important for us to think about this nuanced definition of power, rather than just saying, well, you're able to influence people through the use of resources. Well, how are you actually doing it? Because some exercises of power are inherently more dangerous than some other exercises of power. So keep this Gaventa typology of power in your mind, because we're going to return to this as we talk about future topics in this class, because a lot of what we talk about really has to do with power. Who has the power to do this? Is this something that belongs to a public administrator? Is this a power that belongs to the courts? Is this a power that belongs to an elected official? Is this a power that resides with individual members of the public? So I just think it's, again, a good polemic for us to just keep in mind as we move out throughout the course. So I just kind of like that nuanced definition of power, that it's not just kind of a one-size-fits-all type of approach to power. I think when we're talking about separating powers, I think when we talk about it horizontally, we talk about it in terms of separation of powers. I think we're much more familiar with that than we might be with the vertical separation through federalism. We're all familiar with the three branches of government and how that arrangement works. What's a little bit more hidden to us is that vertical relationship between different levels of government. And that's why every summer I offer that PPA 535 intergovernmental relations class, because I really think it's a component that's important to public administration, but it's also a component that I think a lot of public administrators don't really delve into very much. And so I'd like to delve into it a little bit here before our break tonight and really talk about what federalism is and how federalism, this division of power vertically, has really shifted over the past 200 years. And then what we'll do after we talk about federalism, we'll kind of pull it all together and we'll answer my favorite question, the so what question. Well, so what? What is separation of powers? What does federalism mean for what we do as public administrators and as public administration as a field of study? So federalism, as we said, under the Constitution, under constitutional federalism, we only have two levels of government, national and state governments. So from the founding of the nation, from the Constitution, I should say the ratification of the Constitution, in order for the Constitution to be ratified, it had to be ratified by 9 out of 13 states. Once it became ratified, from the ratification of the Constitution up to the beginning of the Civil War in 1861, our relationship between national and state government, our system of federalism, is oftentimes referred to as dual federalism. That's called dual federalism because we had two different levels of government, national and state, and those two different levels of government had their own unique spheres of influence, their own duties and responsibilities, and very seldom did they cross over with each other. So if you think about this in kind of a Venn diagram, you could draw two separate circles, one circle for the national government, one circle for state government, and their lines do not intersect. They are separate from each other. There's a line of demarcation between those two spheres of influence. In federalism, we refer to that as a model of federalism known as the coordinate authority model. Coordinate authority model, dual federalism, you have two different levels of government doing different types of things, kind of doing their own thing. And I think that was really true up until the Civil War. In the lead up to the Civil War, Southern states were very unhappy with Congress. They felt that Congress was being dominated by Northern states. And these Southern states obviously were slave states. And most of their economy, for most Southern states, their economy was predicated upon slavery and the slave trade. Obviously, when they felt that that was being threatened by Congress, they felt that they needed to do something to try and counter what Congress was doing. And so what we saw in the lead up to the Civil War is we had Southern states arguing for states' rights, making the argument that we are sovereign entities. And as sovereign entities, we created the Constitution. The Constitution was not created by individuals. The Constitution, the Union, was created by states, by sovereign states. And as such, this is the argument the Southern states are making. I'm not making it, but the Southern states made this argument that as sovereign entities that created the Constitution, they then also have the ability to then leave the Union as well. That they created the country, they can then leave the country. And we saw a series of progressive strategies. And by progressive, I mean getting more and more severe, that were being used by Southern states. The first strategy that they tried to use is something called interposition. I'll put that in text chat. A strategy called interposition. If I misspell something, because I'm talking and typing, but interposition. Interposition was when Southern states said, we disagree with this law coming out of Congress, so we're going to try and block its implementation. We're going to block its implementation by using all the resources we have at our disposal to make sure this law does not get implemented in our respective state. Interposition. Again, it's something that is not as extreme as leaving the Union, but it was a step toward the secession process. Interposition didn't work that well. So then Southern states decided we need to move to another strategy, And their second strategy was what was called nullification. In nullification, they would simply declare an act of Congress to be null and void if they disagreed with it. So I disagree with what Congress is doing here, so we're going to just say it's null and void. We're going to ignore it. We're not going to try and block its implementation. We're going to say it's invalid, and we're just going to declare it null and void. That's a more severe step that southern states were taking. When that didn't work, then you have the most severe step of all, which was obviously secession. They left the Union, again, the argument being that we created the Union, so therefore we can leave the Union. That argument that states are sovereign and created the Union and can then leave the Union, the antecedents for that were actually planted unwittingly by some of our framers like James Madison. Madison made that argument in Federalist number 39, where he said, let's dissect the Constitution into its component elements. And when he looked at the element of the Constitution, which was, how was this Constitution created? Who created it? He made a very strong argument that it was created by state governments. That argument then was picked up later on by people like John C. Calhoun and some other secession advocates and used as their philosophical basis for then seceding from the Union in 1861. Once these southern states left the Union in the Civil War, obviously you're going to have a change to your system of federalism when the war is over. So in 1865, when the war ends, we have Congress controlled by Republicans. And Republicans in Congress wanted to have a very strict Reconstruction policy that they would impose upon southern states to bring those southern states back into the Union. So what you had after the Civil War, beginning in 1865, was a much more competitive relationship between national and state governments in an era known as competitive federalism, where national and state governments started to compete against each other for power and authority. What we typically saw in competitive federalism is we saw still two separate spheres of influence, but we saw the national sphere of influence greatly expand and the state sphere of influence contract. We saw that in terms of national regulation of things such as commerce and the economy, national government regulation of workplace safety in the late 1800s, early 1900s, national regulation of things such as food safety, national regulation of medicines and pharmaceutical drugs. We saw more and more regulation from the national government, and the sphere of influence greatly grow to the detriment of the sphere of influence for state governments. Again, it's a coordinate authority model because our two spheres are separate from each other. It's just the size of those spheres have now changed in competitive federalism as compared to dual federalism. Competitive federalism, again, begins at the end of the Civil War in 1865, really accelerates all the way through until the early 1930s. In late 1920s, we had the stock market crash, which then brought on the Great Depression. FDR, when he became president, had to try and bring the country out of the Great Depression, and as we said before, he did that through the creation of his New Deal programs. The New Deal programs included a lot of spending of federal money, national government money, the creation of a lot of national government programs, the creation of what we call alphabet agencies, all these new agencies being created at the national government level, a great expansion of national government power and authority. But under the New Deal, a lot of the expansion of authority was done to try and help state governments pull themselves out of the Great Depression. And a lot of that relationship that we started to see grow between national and state governments was defined by the use of money. So we move into an era known as cooperative federalism with the FDR administration and the New Deal in the 1930s. Cooperative federalism really gives us a different model of federalism to look at. So rather than being a coordinate authority where the two spheres are separate, now you really start to have more of that Venn diagram where your two spheres of influence begin to overlap with each other. So there are still some duties that only the national government does, still some duties that only state governments do, but there's a gray area in between where your two circles intersect with each other, And in that gray area, that's the overlapping nature of the relationship between national and state governments. So it's an overlapping authority model of federalism. Again, it's driven primarily by the use of money and the use of federal grants. Since federal grants are so prominent in cooperative federalism, some people will refer to cooperative federalism as fiscal federalism because the relationship between national and state governments really being defined by money and by federal grants in aid. Cooperative federalism runs through the New Deal, through the 40s and into the 50s and into the mid-1960s. Once we get into the Johnson administration, so after the assassination of President Kennedy in 1963, Lyndon Baines Johnson then ascends to the presidency. When Johnson comes into the presidency, Johnson had a different approach to federalism. His approach to federalism is oftentimes referred to as creative federalism. Johnson believed that the national government should be where most decisions are being made. Johnson established a war on poverty, where he wanted to reduce the disparities in wealth between upper income Americans and lower income Americans. That war on poverty would be fueled with national grants and programs that were created at the national level of government. And what Johnson would do is he would use money to induce state and local governments to achieve this national objective of the war on poverty. He would also use what are called mandates. And mandates, and we'll spend a lot of time at the end of our semester together talking about mandates. Mandates are essentially orders. So when one level of government orders another level of government to do something, that's a mandate. So he would issue these mandates requiring state and now local governments to take certain types of actions in order to help achieve those objectives that were established in Washington, D.C. at the national level of government. We also saw the Civil Rights Movement, and we saw the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, the Voting Rights Act in 1965, the Fair Housing Act in 1968. Again, these were acts that were meant to further the national objective of anti-discrimination, and we used grants as well as mandates to bring state and local governments along in trying to achieve those national objectives. Since Johnson in creative federalism believed that the decisions should be made at the national level, we now introduce a third model of federalism called inclusive authority model. In the inclusive authority model, you would draw three concentric circles. The national circle would be the biggest, and then subsumed within the national circle would be a state circle, which is smaller, and subsumed within the state circle would be a local circle, which is even smaller than the state. The idea being that state power relies upon, local power relies upon state power relies upon national power. In that type of an arrangement, in inclusive authority, where you have the three circles all subsumed within each other, whenever you have the federal government increasing its power, it usually does so at the detriment of state and local governments. When the state government increases its power, it typically does so at the detriment of local governments. And the local governments are kind of, the only way they increase their power is if the state government allows them to. There's a old rule in federalism and intergovernmental relations known as Dillon's rule. And Dillon's rule says that local governments are creatures of the state. States create local governments, then empower those local governments, and the extension of that argument is that if they create and empower local governments, states can also destroy local governments. The local governments are fully creatures of the state in which they are located. Power of local government comes from state constitutions. Local governments have no standing in the national constitution. So that was our good friend Lyndon Johnson and his approach to federalism, very much inclusive authority, using grants and mandates as creative tools to get state and local governments to do the bidding of the national government. Sometimes for great reasons, such as civil rights, sometimes for not so great reasons either in other policy areas. So we see this creative era of federalism in the Johnson administration. It's a very brief era of federalism because it runs from the Johnson administration when he was inaugurated, the death of John F. Kennedy on November 7th, 1963, up until he left office in January of 1969. Johnson decided not to run for re-election, primarily because of the war in Vietnam, and made an announcement pretty early that he would not run for the nomination for the Democratic Party. So then we have the election of 1968. And in 1969, we have Richard Nixon come into the White House. When Richard Nixon came into the White House, he brought with him a different approach to federalism, a new approach to federalism that us creative federalism scholars have dubbed new federalism, not terribly creative, but very descriptive. And in Nixon's new federalism, it kind of returned us to this idea of coordinate authority model, in that what Nixon said is power should be turned over to state and local governments, that it shouldn't be the national government making the decisions. Decisions should be made by governments that are located closest to the people, closest to the voters, which would be state and local governments. So under new federalism, what Nixon did is he engaged in what we call the 3 Ds of federalism. Decentralization. In decentralization, he wanted to decentralize the decision-making process. So unlike Johnson, decisions wouldn't be made in Washington, D.C. Decisions would be decentralized down to the state and the local level of government. His second D of federalism was what we call devolution. In devolution, he says, not only are we going to decentralize decision-making, but we are going to devolve power. We are going to give power and resources to state and local governments to carry out the decisions that they have made. So we have to empower them to be able to do these types of things that they want to do. And then your third D is deregulation. So remove these regulations and allow the private sector to do a lot of these functions that the public sector used to do. Remove some of these national regulations, not only from corporations, but also from state and local governments, and free them up to make their own types of decisions. So decentralization, devolution, and deregulation were the 3 Ds of Nixon's new federalism. In 1981, we have Ronald Reagan come into office. And when Reagan comes into office, he kind of reinvigorates and restarts this idea of new federalism. And during the Carter administration in the late 1970s, he kind of departed from new federalism and started doing more things at the national level. Then when Reagan comes in 81, he brings back Nixon's new federalism in what federalism scholars, again, in a very non-creative way, say is new federalism. It's new federalism done again. So in Reagan's new approach to federalism, it's a rehash of the Nixon approach. And so what Reagan decided to do is he decided that when he would approach federalism, he would do so again by trying to turn responsibilities over to state and local governments. One of the main vehicles he used to do it is the use of what's called a block grant. And we'll talk a lot about grants once we get to once we get a little bit later on in the class. But with block grants, you are giving out a much more no strings attached or few strings attached type of grant of money. And I don't want to get too much in the weeds here. I know we're kind of running long before our break, but there are 2 basic kinds of grants. There are what are called categorical grants and block grants. Categorical grants are very specific grants of money that need to be used for specific purposes with a lot of specific reporting requirements. Those are the types of grants that Johnson used in creative federalism, because a categorical grant allows you to hold the recipient accountable for exactly how they spent that money. So it allows you to make sure that they are using the money to further those national objectives. In a block grant, it's a more general grant where you spend the money in a general program area, but how specifically you spend the money is up to you. As long as you are using it in the general program area, you can spend it in a variety of different ways. It decentralizes and devolves the decision-making down to the recipient level, the state or the local government level. And that was Reagan's approach then to federalism. What has happened is that it seems we have this, what we like to call the ping pong effect in political science. The ping pong effect is when you have new presidential administrations that come in and try and undo what their predecessors did. And then their successor will come in and try and undo what they did, and so on and so on. We kind of ping pong back and forth in terms of approaches. But even though we kind of ping pong back and forth ideologically, a lot of our decisions in federalism tend to be made in a contextual type of basis. So if you had to ask what era of federalism are we currently in, I would argue we're currently in an era known as contextual federalism. And by contextual federalism, what I mean is that our approach to which level of government should have the power depends upon the context of the issue. That for some administrations, they have tried to centralize power in Washington, D.C. for one issue, and then will decentralize power to state and local governments for another issue or another policy. And we've got a lot of really good examples of this, but I'll give you one example from the Clinton administration back in the 1990s, and then we'll leave this topic. But in the Clinton administration in the 1990s, I'll give you one example, the blood alcohol content example. Every state has its own levels of what they consider as drunk driving, or called blood alcohol content or BAC levels. So when Clinton came into office in 1993, states all had different approaches. For some states, it was a 0.08. For some states, it was a 0.10. For some states, it was a 0.12. Every state kind of had its own approach to blood alcohol content levels and drunk driving. Clinton wanted to nationalize it. He wanted there to be one blood alcohol content level, a national standard that all states must abide by. And that national standard he wanted was 0.08. The way in which he accomplished that, because blood alcohol content levels obviously are not listed in the Constitution, is he used some creative tools to try and induce state governments to adopt a 0.08 blood alcohol content level. In doing that, he's taking a very national approach. Everyone should have the same approach used by the national government. But then contrast that to welfare reform in the mid-1990s. When Clinton was president, he signed off on a bill passed by a Republican majority in Congress to completely overhaul welfare policy. And that welfare reform law was called the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act, very long name for essentially welfare reform. What they did in that act is they replaced categorical grants with block grants, and they provided a lot more discretion to states in how they would move people from welfare to work. So they could choose their own approach for how they were going to move people off the welfare rolls and get them into gainful employment. That's a decentralization, devolution type of an approach. So the blood alcohol content levels for that issue is very centralizing. For the issue of welfare reform, the administration is very decentralizing, again, depending upon the context of the issue. I think that's something we saw in the Bush administration. We've seen that in the Obama administration as well. We saw that in the Trump administration. And I know we're kind of early in the Biden administration, but I'm sure we're going to see a lot of that in the Biden administration, where it really depends upon the context of the issue, which level of government should have the majority of power and responsibility. What I want you to take from this discussion is that federalism, this vertical division and separation of powers between different levels of government, that's a dynamic situation in that it has changed multiple times over the past 200 years. One of the main reasons why it has changed is because of the predisposition of the administration in the White House. But another reason why our approach to federalism changes is because of the composition of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ends up being the ultimate interpreter of the Constitution and what the framers meant by federalism in the Constitution. So when we have a more liberal majority on the court, we tend to see more centralization and allowing the national government to do more centralizing. When we see a conservative majority of the court, it tends to be a predisposition towards states' rights and having state governments be the place where these types of important decisions are being made. As you go through the history of the Supreme Court, you will see the court kind of swing back and forth between a liberal majority to a conservative majority, and that explains a lot of this pendulum swinging back and forth between centralization and decentralization throughout our entire 200-year history of federalism. So I know we're going long, so I want to give you a break. Let's wrap this up very quickly. So what does this mean for public administration? What does the idea of separating powers horizontally and separating powers vertically through federalism, what does that mean for us as public administrators? Well, number one, obviously, it means we serve many masters. We have to be held accountable to a legislative body, to the chief executive and the executive branch, to the courts and the judiciary. We also have to be held accountable to the national government and the state government, in addition to the local government. So we have masters both horizontally as well as vertically. When you have these multiple masters, we have all these different institutions that you have to serve. You oftentimes end up with conflicting directions that you receive. So the legislature may say, this is what we want to accomplish with this program. And then the chief executive come in and say, no, I want to accomplish something completely different. Those conflicting directions then make it difficult for public administrators to know how they are supposed to implement these laws and these policies. We operate as public administrators in this very complex network of both cooperation as well as competition. The different levels of government compete with each other. The different branches of government compete with each other. We have to try and find some grounds of cooperation where we can get the branches and the levels of government to cooperate together to make our jobs a little bit easier in terms of implementing these policies and these programs. And it really does create this ecology or this environment of public administration. John Gauss tells us if you want to understand what a public organization does, we have to understand its ecology, the environment that surrounds it. And because of this separation of powers and federalism systems, we have a lot of fragmentation that goes on within that environment. And we as public administrators and public organizations have to deal with that power fragmentation both horizontally as well as vertically. And so being a public administrator in America certainly means you're going to have to behave differently and think differently than if you were a public administrator in England, or if you're a public administrator in Nigeria, or a public administrator certainly in Saudi Arabia. In the past, I've had some students from Saudi Arabia who have come over to get their MPA degrees. And when we talk about some of these things like fragmentation of power and federalism and separation of powers, it's a very difficult concept for them because they're not comfortable with that. They don't have experience with that. They have experience with the monarchy and how the king and the royal family really control most things that go on, even at the regional government level. And so there's a lot more micromanagement that goes on in Saudi Arabia than what you might have here as a public administrator in America. But again, I think it is important that we kind of have established that common base level of, this is American government, and this is the influence that American government has on what we do on a daily basis as public administrators. But again, this all flows out of our Constitution, our social contract. So as public administrators, we are held accountable for making sure that we know and protect the constitutional rights of citizens that we deal with. We no longer have sovereign immunity. You can't just say, well, I work for government, so therefore I cannot be held accountable. I cannot be sued for my actions. You can't say that anymore. You now have qualified good faith immunity, which means that if you are operating in good faith within the parameters of your position, and you are not violating the constitutional rights of people you are dealing with, then you have a limited amount of immunity. However, if you intentionally violate the constitutional rights of people you are dealing with, of the citizenry, then you have violated your oath of office. Then you will then be subject to prosecution. And we have seen that in some high-profile cases of late. So it's very important for us to know what those constitutional rights are. And that's why we're going to spend the second half of class tonight looking at the Constitution and highlighting those rights that are afforded to citizens within that Constitution. Again, I've gone longer than I wanted the first half of class. I apologize for that. I know it's 5:40, so let's go ahead and take a break now. Let's take about a 10-minute break. That's okay with everyone. Let's come back at 5:50. We come back at 5:50. I'll have the Constitution on the screen. We'll go through the Constitution again, not every single word, but go through some highlights of the Constitution and the types of rights that we need to be aware of and protect for the citizens we come into contact with. So take a break and come on back at 5:50. All right, everyone, we are back. Hope you had a good, albeit very short break. Again, I don't want to belabor the Constitution too much and go through all the different parts of it, but I do want to kind of highlight for you some of the major elements, again, to underscore the whole idea of these compromises that we saw made in the Constitution, as well as to, again, highlight these constitutional rights and our obligations as public administrators to abide by and maintain the rights of individuals we deal with. So I don't know how often you've had the chance to go through and review the Constitution. I think we probably don't review it as Americans nearly as much as we should. In previous years, we usually had members of Congress who would literally carry around with them a copy of the Constitution. And I know Bob Dole is an example. He would always in his pocket carry a copy of the Constitution, and in another pocket, he would carry a copy of the Federalist Papers. And I don't know if members of Congress do that a lot anymore, but perhaps it's something that they should start doing that practice again. So the Constitution, and you probably read through it for preparation for class, you probably noticed that it's a very well organized document, and that is organized according to articles. There are 7 articles in the Constitution, each article talking about different types of items. So Article 1 of the Constitution talks about the Congress and the bicameral nature of the Congress. Article 2 talks about the presidency. Article 3 talks about the judiciary and specifically the Supreme Court. Article 4 talks about full faith and credit. Article 5 talks about, Article 6 talks about the Supremacy Clause, and that the laws and the treaties of the United States should be the supreme law of the land. I skipped Article 5. Article 5 talks about how we amend the Constitution, and then Article 7 talks about how we ratify the Constitution and put the Constitution into effect. So every article has a different areas of focus. Article 1 establishes for us, again, this bicameral legislature. We see that in Article 1, Section 1. We establish a House of Representatives. We establish a U.S. Senate. The terms for members of the House of Representatives are limited to 2-year terms. You must be at least 25 years old to serve in the U.S. House of Representatives. You serve, like as I said, a 2-year term. You have to have been a citizen of the United States for at least 7 years, and you have to be an inhabitant of the state in which you are chosen to represent. In Article 1, Section 1, we also get into some specifics about the House itself in terms of the positions in the House. So the House of Representatives, you see at the bottom of Section 2, House of Representatives, they choose their own Speaker of the House. The Speaker is the only constitutional actor that's mentioned in the Constitution for the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives also then has the sole power of impeachment. In the Trump administration, we saw 2 different impeachments of former President Trump. And when those impeachments occur, it's the sole power of the House to impeach the president, whereby the House will pass articles of impeachment, and then the trial then gets held in the U.S. Senate. And I'm assuming most of you watched a lot of the hearings that went into passing articles of impeachment, and you probably then watched the trial in the Senate and how the trial occurred there in the Senate. Article 1, Section 3 then turns its attention to the U.S. Senate. Again, we have equal representation in the Senate, and so every state gets 2 senators. Senators serve much longer terms than members of the House. They serve 6-year terms. In order to serve in the Senate, you have to be at least 30 years old, so you have to be 5 years older to serve in the Senate than in the House of Representatives. We also, when the Constitution was drafted, it split up the Senate into thirds. And so every 2 years, 1/3 of the Senate would be up for re-election. So you wouldn't have all 100 senators coming up for re-election all at the same time. 1/3 of the Senate comes up every 2 years. As I said, you have to be 30 years old in order to be a senator. You must have been a citizen of the United States for at least 9 years. And again, you must be an inhabitant of the state from which you are chosen. The Vice President of the United States has the job of being the President of the Senate. And the Vice President of the United States, when serving as President of the Senate, does not vote unless there is a tie. That has become very germane recently for us because of the split between Republican and Democrat in the Senate. When you have this essentially 50-50 split, even though two of those Democrats are not truly Democrats. Senator Bernie Sanders from the state of Vermont is an independent, but he caucuses with the Democrats, so he gets included as a Democratic vote. And Senator Angus King from the state of Maine is also an independent, but he also caucuses with the Democrats. And so that's why we have a 50-50 split in the Senate. We have seen a few occasions where the vote has been split 50-50, and then you've had the Vice President Kamala Harris come over and then cast the tie-breaking vote. The Senate, like the House, has its own ability to choose its own officers. The constitutional position is a president pro tem of the Senate. The president pro tem of the Senate is typically the longest serving member from the majority party in the Senate. They technically have the responsibility of presiding when the vice president is not presiding as the president of the Senate. But if you ever watch the Senate on C-SPAN, you'll realize that it's very rarely the vice president of the United States who's presiding. It's very rarely the president pro tem who presides. They will select a different member to go and preside and sit up at the desk as they're doing debates and as they are handling their business. The really important members of the Senate Majority Leader and Minority Leader, so Mitch McConnell for the Republicans, Chuck Schumer for the Democrats, those are two extremely important positions. They're not necessarily constitutional positions, but they have been positions with the growth of the two-party system that have become very important for the orderly functioning of the U.S. Senate. As we said, the Senate has the sole power to try impeachments. And so articles of impeachment are passed by the House of Representatives. They then go over to the Senate. The Senate then holds a trial to determine whether or not the president is guilty or whomever is being charged with impeachment is guilty of those crimes. And the presiding officer in trials of impeachment will be the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. So John Roberts has had the opportunity to preside as the presiding officer for the Trump impeachments. William Rehnquist, who was the Chief Justice back in the 90s, had the opportunity to preside over the Clinton impeachment trial. Those impeachment trials obviously have not resulted in convictions. The closest we have come to convicting a president in an impeachment trial is way back in Andrew Johnson, back in the 1860s. Andrew Johnson was impeached by the Republicans in Congress for not implementing, for basically ignoring a law that was passed by Congress. And he survived removal from office, survived being found guilty of impeachment by one vote in the Senate. So that's the closest we have come to actually finding someone guilty and removing that person from the office of the presidency. Now, other people have been found guilty in impeachment trials. We've had judges, federal judges who have been found guilty. So it has happened. It just hasn't happened to a sitting president as of yet. If you are found guilty of impeachment, then your punishment does not extend further than removal from office and disqualification to hold or enjoy any office of honor, trust, or profit under the United States. This was something that was a point of contention in the most recent impeachment trials as to whether or not you can divorce those two things, removing the person from office and then disqualifying them from holding any future office. And that's something that the parliamentarian in the U.S. Senate has ruled on. Different parliamentarians have ruled differently at different points in time, whether it has to be removal and disqualification, or if you can just remove someone from office but not disqualify them from future office. The past practice has typically been the two kind of working together. If you get removed from office, you are then disqualified from serving in future office. Section 4 then talks about the holding of elections, talks about how often you have to meet. talks about each house, the House and the Senate, maintaining its own journal. That may sound very mundane, but that is important, because if you ever watch C-SPAN, you'll see a member of the House or Senate get up there. Oftentimes before they speak, they ask permission to revise and extend my remarks. When you ask to revise and extend your remarks, this oftentimes happens in the House because you have very limited amount of time to stand on the House floor and say what you want to say. And you usually have a lot more things to say than you have time for. So if you extend and revise your remarks, then what you can do is you can put those remarks into the congressional record, into the journal, and then people can read your comments that later on that you didn't have time to actually verbalize when you were standing on the floor of the House or the Senate, but usually the House. Section 6, the members get compensation. As we'll see in the 27th Amendment, there's a limitation on when they can increase their compensation. You can't serve in any other civil office while you are serving in Congress. It's an important one there. Section 7. Here's a really important part that we oftentimes overlook in terms of the legislating process. Article 1, Section 7 requires that all revenue-raising bills must originate in the House of Representatives. So any bill that's going to increase taxation, that bill must start in the House rather than the Senate. And again, that was done intentionally by the framers because the House is the lower house. It's closer to the people, and the people are going to be directly affected by any increases in their taxes. So they have more of a say in electing the members of the House. Under the original Constitution, members of the Senate were selected by state legislatures. So voters did not directly elect their members of the Senate, but they did directly elect members of the House. Therefore, they could hold them accountable for increasing their taxes. Section 7 also spells out for us how a bill becomes a law. And you've probably watched Schoolhouse Rock as a kid, and you know that bill as it comes down the steps, how it goes through the process of becoming a law. But before a bill can become a law, before it can be signed by the president, it must be passed in uniform version between the House as well as the Senate. So they have to hammer out the differences. They usually do that in a conference committee. Then once the conference committee hammers out the differences between the House and the Senate version, the bill then goes back to the floor of the House and back to the floor of the Senate for passage again, so it can then go to the president in identical format between the two houses. So that's all spelled out for you there in Section 7. Arguably, the most important part of Article 1 is our good friend Article 1, Section 8. There are two important features in Article 1, Section 8. One important feature is the enumeration of powers. So in Article 1, Section 8, we enumerate, or in other words, we list the specific powers that Congress has. Whenever you enumerate powers, whenever you list powers, what you are doing is you are inherently limiting the powers of Congress. Because the assumption is if it's a power that is not listed, it's not enumerated, then it's a power that doesn't naturally belong to Congress. It's going to belong to someone else, either the states or to the people. So by enumerating powers, you're limiting the power of Congress. So some of the enumerated powers of Congress, Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxation. They can charge taxation. They can borrow money, and we are painfully aware of Congress and its borrowing of money. We have run federal budget deficits every single year since 1969 up until today, with the exception of only 2 years. So they're very, very good at borrowing money. The next one on there, to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with Indian tribes. That's what's referred to as the Commerce Clause of the Constitution. When Congress expands its power, especially over state and local governments, one vehicle it oftentimes uses to expand its power is that Commerce Clause. So they can regulate interstate commerce. So if it's commerce that's going between the states, Congress has the ability to regulate that interstate commerce. They're much more limited in their ability to regulate intrastate commerce, so commerce that only occurs within a given state. But they have great power to regulate commerce that goes between the states. Huge, huge, important power for Congress. Congress also then has the power to establish uniform rules of naturalization, how people become citizens, laws in terms of bankruptcies. They can coin money. Again, this is a major problem of the Articles of Confederation. Now Congress has the explicit power to coin money. So money is printed at the national level. It's not coined at the state or the local level. Punish counterfeiting, to establish post offices. And so this is one of the enumerated powers of Congress, to establish post offices. One of the reasons why we have the U.S. Postal Service today. To promote the progress of science and the useful arts. So we have the National Science Foundation today. To constitute tribunals inferior to the Supreme Court. That's a pretty innocuous little clause there, but it's extremely important. What that meant is that Congress had the ability to establish all federal courts underneath the Supreme Court. So Article 3 only creates one court, it creates the Supreme Court. All of the courts under that, all of our circuit courts of appeal and what they come to be known as district courts as well, all those federal courts were created by Congress. And Congress created those courts initially in the Judiciary Act. Define, punish piracy and felonies, to declare war. Congress has the sole power to declare war. Presidents may not declare war. Presidents can engage in military actions, but they cannot issue a declaration of war. Only Congress can do that. So when presidents have wanted to declare war, like they did in World War I and World War II, they had to go and ask Congress's permission and have Congress do the declaration of war. So the president goes before a joint session of Congress, asks Congress to declare war, and that's then what precipitated World War I as well as World War II. For World War I, just an interesting note, there were numerous objections in Congress to going to World War I. In World War II, there was only one objection, and that was from a member of the House named Jeanette Rankin. And she was one of the same people who also objected to World War I. So she objected to both World War I as well as World War II, but she was the sole objection to going to war in World War II, which is a little trivia for you there if you're interested. Raise and support armies, to provide and maintain a navy, to regulate and control land and naval forces, call forth militias and instance of insurrections and to repel invasions. Again, this is a concern we had under the Articles of Confederation that we were trying to rectify, or they were trying to rectify. Arming and disciplining the militia. I remember in the Second Amendment, it says a well-regulated militia being necessary. This is that well-regulated militia that was discussed. That it was eventually would be discussed in the Second Amendment. And then at the end of Article 1, Section 8, we then have this other important part. So I said there are two main things with Article 1, Section 8. The first is the enumeration of specific powers that inherently limits the power of Congress. At the end here of Article 1, Section 8, we have what we call the elastic clause, or the necessary and proper clause, to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. So all of those powers are just enumerated. Congress can do everything that's necessary and proper to be able to carry out those powers, and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or in any department or officer thereof. This elastic clause means that Congress can do anything that it deems necessary and proper to allow it to do its job of executing all those powers aforementioned in Article 1, Section 8. So whereas enumeration, listing of powers, limits the power of Congress, this elastic clause, the necessary and proper clause, greatly expands the power of Congress. So when Congress has expanded its power over state and local governments, it's done it primarily through the Commerce Clause and the elastic clause. And those are the two bases that Congress has used to expand its power. Then we have some limitations that are placed upon Congress in Article 1, Section 9. Article 1, Section 9, we then have the prohibition against banning the slave trade until at least 1808. Again, it was a provision put in there to try and mollify some of the slave states to get them to ratify the Constitution. Congress is not allowed to suspend what we call writ of habeas corpus. That literally means to present the body. And so if someone is arrested, you need to know what they were arrested for and where they are located. You can't arrest someone and then stick them away in a jail somewhere and never have a trial for them. Congress may pass no bills of attainder. A bill of attainder is basically finding someone guilty without having a trial, so that's not allowed. They also cannot pass any of these things called ex post facto laws. Ex post facto laws are laws after the fact. So you do something today and it's perfectly legal, then Congress passes a law tomorrow making it illegal and then goes back and punishes you for doing this thing that was legal when you did it. You can't do that. That would be a ex post facto law. There was a provision in there that precluded Congress from levying direct taxes on individuals, that all taxes had to be apportioned according to state population. You see there are brackets around there because that was then taken out as a result of the 16th Amendment to the Constitution, which gave Congress the power to levy taxation on any source whatsoever without apportionment. So you can have a direct income tax now without having to apportion it according to the state's population. So if people tell you today the federal income tax is unconstitutional, that was true then, before 1913, but subsequent to the passage and ratification of the 16th Amendment, that is no longer true. Pay your taxes. No tax or duty shall be laid on articles exported from any state. No preference shall be given by any regulation, commerce, or revenue, the courts, blah, blah, blah. You can read all that on your own. The next paragraph there is an important one. No money shall be drawn from the Treasury, but in consequence of appropriations made by law. What that means is when Congress wants to spend money and wants to take money from the Treasury to spend it, it must first appropriate those funds. An appropriation is just simply saying how that money will be spent. So you have to say this amount of money is going to be spent on this program. You appropriate it for that program. You have to do that before that money can be spent. That's why we have an appropriations process in terms of the federal budget. And we go through this appropriations process for a large amount of our spending. They can't grant any titles of nobility, so you can't have any sirs or any knighting or any of that good stuff like we oftentimes see in England. Section 10 then places limitations upon states. So no state shall enter into any treaty, alliance, or confederation. No state can coin money or issue bills of credit. So there are some limitations in terms of what states can do. States also cannot issue any titles of nobility, any sirs or anything like that. States are very limited in the way in which they can charge any types of tariffs. That kind of belongs to the national level. And you can read through the rest of that. But limitations that are explicitly placed upon state governments come in the form of Article 1, Section 10. So again, Article 1, Section 8 talks about the powers of Congress. Article 1, Section 9 talks about what Congress cannot do. Article 1, Section 10 talks about what state governments cannot do. Article 1 is by far the lengthiest and the most detailed article in the entire Constitution. That's one of the reasons why a lot of political scientists will refer to Congress as being the first branch of government. Not only is it spoken of first in Article 1, but it is also dealt with in a much more specific manner than any of the other branches of the government. Article 2 then focuses on the president, the executive branch. It's a much briefer article without quite the same detail and nuance that we see in Article 1. So we have a president of the United States, the chief executive officer, essentially. The president serves a 4-year term. And under the original Constitution, the president was the person who got the most votes. The person who got the second most votes would then become vice president. Problem with that, obviously, if you saw Hamilton, I'm sure you're familiar with this, is that Jefferson, when he was president, his vice president was Aaron Burr. They didn't like each other. They were mortal enemies. But Burr, being from a different party, ended up coming in second. That's how he became vice president. Jefferson was so dismayed by that Jefferson then recommended the constitutional amendment that would then have presidents and vice presidents essentially run together on the same ticket. We had established here in Article 2, Section 1, the idea of the electoral college. And this is, again, one of those very unique aspects of American government that you don't see in a lot of other countries, if any. What the framers did is they established this electoral college. The reason why they established electoral college, it's kind of a twofold reason. One reason is it was a nod to small states. So it was kind of a protection to small states so that they would also have a say in selecting the president. Secondly, there was also distrust among the delegates in regards to ordinary voters and average ordinary citizens. Remember, these delegates were from the upper strata of the economy. They were the creditors. They were the best educated. They really had a concern about having a president chosen by just regular voters. Again, at that time, regular voters were white male property owners, but they were very concerned about that. So the Electoral College could serve as a check on popular sentiment by having these electors who, at least in theory, were better educated about government and better educated about the process, actually doing the selection of the president rather than it being based only on popular votes. So you're probably familiar with the Electoral College and the way in which it works today, which is somewhat different than the way in which the framers had envisioned it. Today we have an Electoral College made up of 538 electors. So you've got 535 electors based upon the 435 representatives in the House, based upon 100 members of the Senate. So that gives you the number 535. The additional 3 are then electors that have been given to the District of Columbia. So DC has 3 electors given to them by the 23rd Amendment to the Constitution. That gives you 538 electors. To win the Electoral College, you have to win a majority of those, which is 270 electors. Whenever we as citizens go and we vote for president, we look at the ballot and we see the names of the candidates. What we're actually voting for is we're voting for their assigned electors. So every candidate campaign will put together a slate of electors in every state. So when you go there and you voted for Donald Trump or you voted for Joe Biden, you're actually voting for Donald Trump's electors or Joe Biden's electors. Then for the most part, this isn't true in all states, but for the most part, if you win you're the candidate who wins the popular vote in that state, then you get all the electors from that state. And the number of electors a state has depends upon their representation in the House and then +2 for the representation in the Senate. Clearly here in California, we have the most electors. We have we really have 1/5 of the total amount of electors in the entire Electoral College. So we really have a lot to say in terms of who gets to be elected president. There are 2 states that don't do that winner-take-all approach. There are 2 states that apportion electors based upon who wins congressional districts within the state. Nebraska and Maine do that. But for the other states, for the most part, they are a winner-take-all system. You win the popular vote in the state, you get all of that state's electors. We know in the last election in 2020, we know that there was some controversy in terms of certifying the electors. Because what would happen is that once you have your electors chosen in each state, then in December, those electors will then get together in the state capitol and they will officially cast their votes. Those votes are then sealed. Those votes are, that list of electors are certified by the state legislature and or the governor. The votes are then sealed, and those sealed votes are then transported to Washington, D.C. to then be opened and read by the Vice President of the United States before this joint session of Congress. Now, what we had obviously on January 6th is the insurrection that was meant to try and stop the counting of the electors. We had some different slates of electors that were put forth by other individuals as being the true slate of electors. And so it was kind of a mess in 2020. But if it works the way it's supposed to work, you have one slate of electors that's certified, goes to Congress, and then is opened and read. And the Vice President just opens them up, reads them, and members of Congress can then object if they would like to object. You have to have one member of the House and one member of the Senate in order to have a successful objection. And then the House and the Senate then recede into their own chambers, and then they have a 2-hour debate about objecting to that later slate of electors. If no one gets a majority of the Electoral College, then the House of Representatives selects who the president will be. When the House of Representatives does that selection, they take your top finishers, and then each congressional delegation in the House gets one vote. So all members of the House from California would get one vote to select their person for president, whoever they want for president. New Jersey would get one vote. It doesn't depend upon how big the state is. Every state delegation gets one vote. The House selects the president, and then the Senate would select the vice president. And that's this kind of interesting system we have known as the Electoral College. Now, there are several states that have indicated their desire to move away from this Electoral College system. And the way in which they would do it is they want to do it essentially based upon popular vote. And so we'll see if we get enough states that agree to that, then the Electoral College as we know it will no longer be functioning the way we've seen it function over the past couple hundred years. But there have been some instances where no one has been able to get a majority in the Electoral College, but a lot more instances where the results of the popular vote look different than the results in the Electoral College. One example of that was in 2000 is a good example. 2016 is another good example. The candidate that got more popular votes actually did not get a majority in the Electoral College. But I know we're running short on time, so I don't want to get too much more into the Electoral College, but it is a very interesting type of system. Just again, to do this relatively quickly, Article 2 then lays out some of the responsibilities and powers of the president. The president is commander-in-chief of the armed forces. Very important for the framers to put a citizen in charge of the armed forces. The president also then enters into treaties with the advice and consent of the Senate, which makes the president the chief diplomat for the country. The president can appoint people to fill vacancies in the executive branch, again with confirmation by the Senate. That makes the president the chief executive of the executive branch. The president is required to, from time to time, inform Congress about the state of the union. That's why we have State of the Union addresses that presidents hold, usually in January. That makes the president the chief of state. So the president essentially has all these responsibilities. Another responsibility in Article 2 we don't talk a whole lot about is as chief legislator. Article 2 says that the president also has the power to recommend legislation to Congress. By recommending legislation to Congress, a lot of political scientists will argue that then makes the president the chief legislator for the country as well. Presidents have the ability to sign legislation. They also have the ability to veto legislation. As you know, if a president vetoes legislation, it then can be overridden by a 2/3 vote of both the House and the Senate. At the end down here in Article 2, we have the actual oath that presidents must recite, and you can't deviate from that because that is constitutional. We had an interesting situation in the Obama administration with the inauguration of President Obama. Chief Justice Roberts read the inauguration. When he read the oath and had President Obama repeat the oath, Roberts screwed up the oath and he got the oath wrong. He got a few words in the wrong place. He then insisted that later on that day in the Oval Office, he would administer the oath again to President Obama to do it correctly, because the Constitution requires these actual words said in that actual sequence when you are inaugurated into being the president. Again, we've laid all of this out before in terms of commander-in-chief. We've laid it out in terms of chief executive, the veto power, all those good types of things. Presidents and the vice president, all of those civil officers in Section 4 shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, and other high crimes and misdemeanors. Through every single impeachment we have seen, whether it be the 2 Trump impeachments or the Clinton impeachment, there's been a rigorous debate had about what the framers meant by high crimes and misdemeanors. Today we think about a misdemeanor as not really being very much of a high crime. At that time, I think the framers, a lot of historians argue, the framers liked the term misdemeanor. It came out of English law, and that's why they used the term misdemeanor there for impeachment. Article 3 then talks about the Supreme Court and only the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court is the only court that's established in Article 3 of the Constitution. Members of the Supreme Court obviously serve for life for good behavior. The Supreme Court is given two types of jurisdiction. They're given original jurisdiction and appellate jurisdiction. Original jurisdiction are cases that can go immediately to the Supreme Court. Appellate jurisdiction means that the Supreme Court gets these cases after they've already gone through the state courts and through the federal courts. The vast majority, 99.999999% of cases, go to the Supreme Court through appellate rather than original jurisdiction. It's very unusual for the courts to get a case under original jurisdiction. What you'll see is missing in Article 3 any qualifications to be a Supreme Court justice. There are no age requirements, no education requirements, no requirements to be a lawyer. Article 3 is silent on all those requirements. Article 4, best known for the full faith and credit provision, which means that states must give full faith and credit to the laws from other states, meaning that states must respect other state laws. Article 5 then talks about how we amend the Constitution. There are essentially 4 ways that we can amend the Constitution. Despite there being 4 ways, we've only used way number 1. That's the only approach we've ever used. The first way to amend the Constitution, the one we use all the time, is a constitutional amendment proposed by a 2/3 vote of the House and the Senate, and then ratified by 3/4 of state legislatures. That's the one way that we've always used to amend the Constitution. But there are 3 other ways that we haven't used that are possible under the Constitution. The second way is proposal by 2/3 of the House and the Senate, and then ratification by 3/4 of state constitutional conventions. So rather than have it done by legislatures, we have the ratification done by constitutional conventions in each individual state. The third approach is to have 2/3 of the states petition Congress for a constitutional convention. And then any amendments that come out of that national constitutional convention then get ratified by 3/4 of state legislatures. And then the fourth and final way we can do it, 2/3 of the states can petition Congress for a national constitutional convention, and then amendments that come out of that national constitutional convention then get ratified by state constitutional conventions in each individual state. Now, obviously, having constitutional conventions, either at the state or the national level, is kind of terrifying to us. And so that's why we don't want to do it. And that's why we never do it, because we know what happened at the Constitutional Convention. We got rid of the articles and replaced them with a brand new Constitution. Who's to say that would not happen again if we had either a national or a state constitutional convention? So we only use approach number 1. Proposal of the amendment by 2/3 of the House and the Senate, and ratification by 3/4 of state legislatures. Article 6, one of the most important things of Article 6 is that second paragraph there. The Constitution and laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made or which shall be made under the authority of the United States, shall be the supreme law of the land. So we're seeing that national laws, national constitution are supreme to state laws and state constitutions. Then in Article 7, I know there's a lot we're not covering, but you've read through it on your own. I'm just kind of hitting the highlights in the limited time we have. Article 7 then tells us how the Constitution gets ratified. The Constitution, to be ratified and go into effect, must be ratified by at least 9 out of 13 states. The problem that we ran into is that we had ratification by 9 states very, very quickly. But one state that did not ratify the Constitution right away was the state of New York. Since New York did not ratify the Constitution technically went into effect, but if New York was not abiding by it, then it really had very little effect, because New York was really the linchpin of commerce among the colonies at that point in time. So if New York was not a player in this new union, everything kind of falls apart from a commerce perspective. So what the framers had to do is they had to convince the citizens of New York to support this new constitution, which meant convincing the anti-federalists, or at least a portion of the anti-federalists, to ratify the Constitution. So the two ways in which they approached to do that, the first way they tried to do that was through the writing of the Federalist Papers, and the second way they did it was through the inclusion of the first 10 amendments to the Bill of Rights. So almost immediately, we go and amend the Constitution right off the bat with the first 10 amendments to the Constitution in the Bill of Rights. And again, the purpose of the Bill of Rights was to try and mitigate some of the concerns that anti-federalists had that the national government was going to be too strong and it would erode the rights of state governments as well as individual citizens. So we get this Bill of Rights added to the Constitution for that purpose. And then we have James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and to a lesser degree, John Jay, who got together and wrote the Federalist Papers, 85 Federalist Papers that were meant to kind of sell the Constitution to anti-federalists and to the citizens of New York. We talk a lot about those Federalist Papers. We don't talk a lot about the anti-federalist papers. And whether you're aware of it or not, there's also a section of papers known as the anti-federalist papers that were written by anti-federalists. The anti-federalist papers aren't very well known at all because obviously to the victor go the spoils, and the Federalists kind of won out with the Constitution. And so that's why we tend to read the Federalist Papers as opposed to the anti-federalist papers. So we have these first 10 amendments to the Constitution that are written to try and again alleviate the concerns of anti-federalists and the citizens of New York. So we articulate these specific rights that will be retained by people. You're very familiar with your First Amendment rights. So you have freedom of religion. Freedom of religion is broken up into two different sections. There's the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. Congress shall make no law respecting establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. That's an important distinction because over the years, the way in which the First Amendment's been interpreted is that the Establishment Clause is pretty much unfettered. That Congress cannot have a national religion. They can't tell you what you need to believe. However, when it comes to your exercise of your religion, there can be some laws to limit that exercise. If the exercise of your religion endangers the public or infringes on someone else's rights, then there can be limitations. So you can't do all religious practices out in the public square if it puts the public in danger. So there are some limitations to free exercise clause. Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of speech. We know that there are some limitations there as well. You can't yell fire in a crowded theater because of the potential for harm to the public. Or the press. And we know that we have freedom of the press. It's very important that we have the press to report, hopefully, in an unbiased way about what government is doing and what government officials are doing. There are obviously some limitations in terms of that, but it's a pretty broad grant of freedom for the press. Congress also may not limit the right of people to peaceably assemble. Now, we do have limitations based upon that. If you want to protest, sometimes you'll have to go and get a permit that will allow you to protest. We've seen at national party nominating conventions, they will cordon off a certain area, oftentimes far away from the convention center, where they'll put all the protesters in there. Again, they do it for the reasoning of protecting public safety. Sometimes it's a little tenuous reasoning, but that's the reasoning that is used. Second Amendment is one we argue about a lot. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. I know it's a very hot button topic for a lot of folks. One thing I would recommend that you do is when you read the Second Amendment, read it in conjunction with Federalist Paper number 29. Alexander Hamilton wrote Federalist Paper number 29, where he lays out his expectations for a well-regulated militia and essentially what is meant by that term well-regulated militia there in the Second Amendment. Third Amendment, no quartering of soldiers. That's a privacy-related amendment, meaning that you can't open up your house to, soldiers can't come in and occupy your house unless it's a time of war. The Fourth Amendment, no unwarrantable, unreasonable search and seizure. So the police have to get a search warrant if they want to come in and search your property. Your Fifth Amendment, more criminal justice types of protections. You have to be indicted by a grand jury for criminal types of charges. You have protection against double jeopardy, that you cannot be tried for the same crime twice. You cannot be deprived of life, liberty, or property without the due process of law. You can't have your private property taken without just compensation, what's known as eminent domain. Some of those rights there in the Fifth Amendment were not fully incorporated to include state government action until many years later. And we don't really have time to go into it now, but one example is double jeopardy. Double jeopardy was not fully incorporated to include a limitation against the state trying you for the same crime twice until 1968. Up until that time, the Supreme Court said that only applied to prohibitions against Congress and the national government. Your Sixth Amendment gives you the right to an impartial jury trial, and you have the right to confront witnesses against you. I left out the no self-incrimination earlier, but it's all part of your criminal justice types of rights. Seventh Amendment, you have a right to a jury trial in civil cases where the value is more than $20. Now, $20 doesn't buy you a whole lot now, but it bought a whole lot back in the late 1700s. No excessive bail, no excessive fines, no cruel and unusual punishment in the Eighth Amendment to the Constitution. Again, we argue about this a lot in terms of the death penalty used by states and what form of death penalty, if any, that they use. The Ninth Amendment, the enumeration of the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. Again, we enumerated listed certain rights that Congress has in Article 1, Section 8. But those rights don't mean that others are not retained by the people. So if the right's not listed, if the power's not listed in the Constitution for Congress, then it belongs to the people. 10th Amendment kind of does the same thing then for state governments. It's called the Reserve Powers Amendment. Powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. Again, this is our approach to try and limit the power of the national government, to reassure the anti-federalists and to reassure the citizens of New York to try and then get this new constitution ratified by all 13 of the states, most notably to get it ratified by the state of New York. I know we're running very short on time, so we'll go through the rest of the amendments very quickly. The 11th Amendment basically just limits the judicial power of the federal government. So it doesn't have broad judicial power that you originally would have expected under the original Constitution. The 12th Amendment to the Constitution, this is the Jeffersonian incentive. This is his approach to try and make sure that the vice president is not a member of a different party. And so it fundamentally changes the way the Electoral College works. Now we have presidents and vice presidents running together on the same ticket. 13th Amendment, extremely important, outlaw slavery. The 14th Amendment is the Equal Protection Amendment. The Equal Protection Amendment then expands the protection of due process with a due process before the deprivation of life, liberty, and property to include the states as well as the national government. There is a provision in here about people who have engaged in insurrection in the past against the national government. Where someone has taken an oath of allegiance to the national government and then engaged in insurrection against the national government could then be precluded from serving in office in the future. I'll let the rest of that go because, again, I know we only have a few minutes left. The 15th Amendment, you cannot deprive people of the right to vote because of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. 16th Amendment allows Congress to levy taxation on any source whatsoever without apportionment, so that then provides us with the direct income tax. 17th Amendment then undoes the selection of senators by state legislatures and makes senators then popularly elected by the people. 18th Amendment is prohibition, very familiar with that one. 19th Amendment is women's suffrage. The 20th Amendment changes the beginning date of the terms for president and Congress. Rather than having the terms start in March, we moved up the terms to start in January which just made more sense if they could start earlier after the election. 21st Amendment repeals prohibition, repeals the 18th Amendment. The 22nd Amendment limits the terms of a president, so he can only serve 2 terms in office. That was done in response to the 4 terms that FDR was elected to when he was president. 23rd Amendment gives 3 electoral votes to the District of Columbia, and that's why we have today 538 electoral votes as opposed to 535. 24th Amendment outlaws poll taxes that were used to limit people's ability to vote and disenfranchise people. So those poll taxes and literacy tests and those things go away as a result of or in theory, go away as a result of the 24th Amendment. 25th Amendment then speaks to presidential succession. And so if a president becomes unable to carry out their duties as president, what happens? Well, obviously the vice president will become president, but what if the president is unfit to serve and the president is not willing to resign from office or does not die? Well, then the vice president, with a majority of the members of the cabinet, can then petition Congress saying that the president is unfit to serve, so the vice president can then take over as the president. The president's not able or willing to contest that, then the vice president then becomes the president. The alternative to that is that Congress may set up a committee to then review the fitness of the president to remain as president, and you can use that committee of Congress's choosing in lieu of the majority of members of the executive cabinet. So it's just a way in which vice presidents can then succeed into the position of president. 26th Amendment gives 18, 19, and 20-year-olds the right to vote. And then the 27th Amendment, the final amendment to the Constitution, says that no law varying the compensation for the services of senators and representatives shall take effect until an election of representatives shall have intervened. The important thing about the 27th Amendment is looking at when it was originally proposed and look at when it was ratified. It was originally proposed by none other than James Madison on September 25th, 1789, and it was ratified on May 7th of 1992. And that's not a misprint. Over 200 years later, it was ratified. When amendments were originally proposed back in the 1700s, they didn't have what we call a sunset provision, in that there was no expiration date. So this is one that was proposed by James Madison to be part of the Bill of Rights. This was supposed to be the 11th Amendment in the Bill of Rights. It never got ratified by 3/4 of state legislatures, and so it just kind of sat there. It didn't have any expiration date, it just kind of sat there. A student in the 1970s in Texas realized that this was still a viable amendment, wrote a paper on it. I believe he got a C from his professor on that paper. Undeterred from that, he went out there and started a nationwide movement to ratify this amendment. And in 1992, got 3/4 of state legislatures to ratify it as a 27th Amendment to the Constitution. It essentially says that if Congress wants to increase its pay, that increase in pay cannot go into effect until they have stood for re-election. So you have to have an intervening re-election before you can get your increase in pay. We've had a lot of other amendments that have been proposed, but they have failed to get the ratification by 3/4 of state legislatures. Today, whenever we propose amendments, they always have a sunset provision. So typically you've got about 7 years to get your amendment ratified. If it doesn't get ratified in 7 years, then it's considered to be inoperable and cannot then at that point be ratified. I know we went through it quickly, but that's the Constitution, the 7 articles, as well as the 27 amendments to the Constitution. We amend the Constitution very rarely. Only 27 times in our history, and 10 of those all came at one point in time. And another one, the 27th, was supposed to be in with those first 10 amendments. So it's a very rare occurrence indeed when we amend the Constitution, because we have designed the amendment process to be difficult, but not impossible. Under the Articles, it was next to impossible. It's not impossible to amend the Constitution, but it is a difficult process. It's difficult to get 2/3 of the House and the Senate to agree to anything today. And it's also very difficult to get 3/4 of states to agree to anything either. So very rare process, but we do it in order to recognize that the Constitution, sometimes its interpretation does have to change with changes in society. Now, I know we're completely out of time. We have 1 minute left. So we'll leave it at that for a discussion of the Constitution. But when we get together next week, I do want to start out with talking about Federalist Paper number 39. Because in Federalist Paper 39, Madison does a very nice job of deconstructing the Constitution into its component elements to try and argue to us whether it's a Federalist or an anti-Federalist type of document. And it's a really nice kind of social science analysis of the Constitution that I think I would like to start next week talking about as kind of a capper on what we've discussed tonight with the Constitution. But then we'll devote most of our time next week to talk about accountability in ethics, transparency in government, and the higher ethical standards we oftentimes encounter as public administrators. So again, I'm sorry to talk so much tonight, but I really wanted to get us to the Constitution because I don't know how many other chances you have to talk about the Constitution in future courses. So very quickly, any questions on this information that we have covered tonight? Remember, you've got your initial skills self-assessment that is due on September 6th, as well as your first discussion board essay. You'll be giving me an initial response to my post, and then you'll also be responding to the post of 2 classmates. Any other questions that emerge between now and next Wednesday, feel free to shoot me an email. Otherwise, we will be back at it again next Wednesday. And like I said, we'll cover ethics and accountability. Okay? All right. Thank you very much. Enjoy what's left of your evening, and I'll talk to you again for week 3 next Wednesday.